This is a re-recording of a talk that I gave at a one-day conference at Wymeswold Church on Saturday, the 11th of April, 2026, that thought about the Reverend Henry Alford and Pugin and the restoration of St Mary's Church, Wymeswold. This particular talk is called All Saints Oakham, Gothic, Despoiled, Restored and Justified. So looking at the wider context of the Pugin-Alford story. I will begin by giving a bit of context and early history of All Saints Church in Oakham. Then I will talk about Gothic Despoiled, looking at the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, Gothic Restored, looking at the work of Gilbert Scott, and finally Gothic Justified, how the restoration of Gilbert Scott was justified in terms that were obviously significant in the late 19th century. So context and early history. That slide shows the castle at Oakham, the old schoolhouse at Oakham and the church at Oakham. And you can see that they all very close together. From a slightly different angle, we can see the castle, the church and the school. And in fact, the castle and the church are on pretty much the same alignment. And we know that there was a free chapel in the castle in the Norman period. And the school was built on the location of a number of guild chapels. And this looks really rather a lot like an Anglo-Saxon or early Norman church group with churches aligned to one another. And here we can see a 1937 picture of an aerial view of the situation. Looking at it on a more conventional map, we can again see the church and the castle pretty much aligned, the school or the guild chapels some way to the side of it. And interestingly, there is a pilgrim route that is recorded in the Middle Ages to Our Lady's Well, about a mile distance. And the church and the well are on a pretty good midsummer sunrise, midwinter sunset solar alignment. That might, of course, simply be coincidence, but if it's not, it speaks to a very ancient, it suggests a very ancient site that was used for ritual purposes, but that must remain speculation. There is actually a Saxon cross built into the south porch of the church. It's not the original position, but the cross looks very like some early Saxon crosses found in Northamptonshire and might well have been put there when the new stone church was built. The first thing we really know about Oakham, however, is from Domesday, when there was certainly a church there, when there was one priest, there was a church and 0.5 hides of church land. Before Domesday, it was held by Queen Edith, the widow of King Edward, and by 1086, it was in the hands of King William, and not long after that, it went into the hands of the Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey. The first stone church was built around 1190 and knocked about a little in the early years of the following century. And it was already at this stage quite a large church, and the building would suggest that it consisted of pretty much a similar ground plan at present, with a nave, north aisle, south aisle, north transept and south transept, no chancel at that stage and no tower. The transepts would have served as the chapels, probably the guild chapels for saying daily masses for their founders. But it was still nonetheless a substantial chapel, which suggests that Oakham was actually quite an important site in some ways. The oldest part of the church between 1190 and 1225 is the south door and the south porch. But over the coming centuries, and I'm not going to go into detail here, the church was basically made higher. and extend it somewhat. So the nave, the modern nave that we can see there was extended upwards, and you can see the original height of the nave picked out in the stonework, and the clerestory added. The chancel similarly was added to the east end of the church and raised to a very considerable height. The tower was 14th century, was probably the uh, something somewhere around that time, and it was added above the west end of the nave. The last parts of the current geometry to be added were the chapels north and south of the chancel. So we have the North Chapel dedicated to the Holy Trinity and the South Chapel dedicated to St. Mary. And you can see the latter is now used fundamentally as a fellowship come refreshment area. So by the Restoration, the church had attained a more or less Gothic form with bits of transitional architecture, bits of decorated, bits of perpendicular, bits of early English indeed. And it's the style of the church was essentially that of a large Gothic church with north aisles, south aisles around a nave with a long chancel and two chapels, chantry chapels, probably to the north and to the south side. In historical terms, the church is perhaps best known for the capitals on the top of the pillars in the nave arcade, which show a whole series of different carvings that in some ways illustrate the story of the gospel. And there you can see some photographs. There is an exhibition of these photographs of these capitals in All Saints Church, if anyone would like to go and see it. The church is also very well endowed with external friezes and gargoyles. Many of these are very similar in form to other churches in Rutland and Leicestershire, which suggests, of course, that the masons were wandering around embellishing various churches in the locality at this time. So moving on then to Gothic despoiled, 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. In 1605, we read from the church guide, the seats on the south aisle are all broken in the bottom and neither paved nor boarded. Pavement in the east and north aisles is broken. The chancel and the chapel on the north side, neither plastered nor whited. Two bell wheels broken but being mended. The communion table unfit. The linen cloths very old. The north door in decay. All was not well. That continued throughout that century. In 1681, an order was made on Mr. Abraham Wright, a vicar, and Mr. Burton, a tenant of the Dean and Chapter of Westminster, to pave the chancel, repair the ceiling, seats and rubbish, and on the church wardens to remove the rubbish out of the churchyard, repave the church alleys throughout, repair the seats and the roof, and glaze the windows, rebind the Bible, provide a new common prayer book, plaster and whitewash the vestry, provide a covering to one of the pewter flagons, a carpet for the communion table of fine green or purple broadcloth, to repair the beam in the middle aisle over the minister's pew, and to take away the seats in the middle aisle. Perhaps a bit unfair on the vicar and wardens because they were basically put out to grass during the period of the Civil War, and they were left fundamentally to clear up the mess afterwards. Century and a half later, we have Sir Stephen Glynn visiting. Sir Stephen Glynn was Baron Glynn of Hawarden in North Wales, and he's perhaps best known as being the owner of the Oak Farm Ironworks that suffered one of the most spectacular financial crashes of the earlier industrial period. But his main activity, really, his hobby, was to go around churches making notes on the states of the churches that he visited. And these notes are all preserved. They're all in the Glynn Archive in the Gladstone Library in Hawarden and open for view. And he writes of All Saints in Oakham. Altogether, the interior is not so well kept as it deserves to be. The pews and galleries are shabby and the whole dirty and untidy. But the exterior is in good preservation, and the stone of excellent quality. The church was restored, as we'll see, in the 1850s, but after the restoration in 1860, in a lecture, the Reverend Canon James writes, he alluded to its condition before the restoration and said in that respect its history was the history of every church in the country, pleasantly touching upon bygone days when it was said that old ladies sat in church with their umbrellas up and the pulpit to the last in mourning for William the Fourth. So there was some despoilation, we might say, of the Gothic church of the Reformation. And so, of course, at that period, when one wanted the best restoration, one called in Sir Gilbert Scott. And his report was quite damning. The roof of the nave, which pretty good roof in design, though constructed as to press somewhat severely upon the clerestory walls, is in a very sad state of decay. One half of it was repaired some years ago, and means were taken to reduce the pressure upon the walls. It will be necessary to do the same throughout, but at the same time, the roof will require thorough reparation. The tower has either through settlement or through the effects of lightning been somewhat split down its southeastern angle and has some few other defects. These must be substantially repaired, and I would recommend the insertion of a tier of strong iron ties to prevent their reappearance. The floor of the tower immediately over the church must be renewed, and the outer floor and the bell timbers substantially repaired. He goes on. The north aisle has most beautiful oak panelled ceiling, which happily conceals its roof from within. The south aisle of the chancel has a modern roof of the very meanest description, so that in the interior of the chancel and its aisles we have a plain flat plaster ceiling to the chancel itself. Then to the north aisle a beautiful oak ceiling showing the manner in which the ancient builders treated their work, and on the south aisle the roof of a modern hedge carpenter, such as would disgrace a cart shed. Forthright in his views, of course. Of the internal fittings, I have but little to say. They exceed in meanness even what is usual in country churches, and there must be but one opinion about them. They must be entirely cleared away and the whole refitted in proper manner with good oak seats. He spoke of the chancel. The chancel has a roof of modern date, concealed by a flat plaster ceiling which cuts across the chancel arch. The same roof extends over the north chancel aisle, thus deforming the east end by placing two divisions under one gable. And here we have one of the puzzles of All Saints. The picture shows a model constructed in the 1850s before the restoration. And you can see there that the chancel and the north chapel are indeed under one roof. And the east wall of the nave in the top left indicates that the chancel originally went much higher up that wall. If we look at a painting from the late 18th century, we see the same thing. The chapel, north chapel and the chancel under one roof, and the large bare wall of the nave towering above it. In modern terms, basically, this is a modern view of the east end of the church, and the red line shows the roof line as seen by Scott. Internally, this would have had dramatic effects. The left-hand picture shows the chancel as it is now. The right-hand picture shows what it would have been like with a blocked off chancel arch, a flat roof in the chancel, and a much smaller east window. So why? Well, I wonder. Perhaps it was just a pragmatic repair. The roof of the chancel was in a bad way, so the best way to repair it was to create a lower roof that covered both the chancel and the north chapel. Or perhaps, and I tend to this view, there was some move to create a communion room. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean a room that was set aside for the quarterly celebration of communion, which would have been separate from the main church, pews around the outside, with the communion table, a trestle table, set north to south in the room. We can see a lovely example of that at a church not far away from Oakham at St. Peter's Brook. And here we see the chancel looking into the communion room, and very unspoiled Elizabethan church here. And now the altar in the communion room after Laudian reforms has been moved back to the West End. And there we can see a closer view of it. And it is quite special to take communion there because as you're presiding, you're looking eastwards out through the window over green fields, and you basically don't know whether there is a congregation there or not. All is quiet, all is still. To the north of the communion room, we see an extension and another view of the extension, looking very like the Oakham setup. So perhaps it was a communion room. Perhaps it was just a pragmatic group affair. Any thoughts on that by people would be appreciated. So then Gilbert Scott did his restoration work and he restored the church very sensitively, mainly carrying out repairs. The mode of treatment I would recommend would be as follows. First, as the chancel roof has been originally of higher pitch, I would renew it in that form and in a manner suit it to the beauty of the church. Secondly, I would thoroughly restore the ceiling of the north aisle, bringing the external roof to its original level. Thirdly, I would put out over some of the south aisle a ceiling corresponding in some degree to that of the north aisle. He basically rebuilt the chancel in the original style. The rest of his repairs were actually quite sensitive, building on what was there. And so there we have the current chancel. The roof of the chancel in the foreground is Scott. The roof in the distance is a 1950s decoration. And we can see just on the left and the right the roofs of the north and south chapels. At the reopening, naturally, there were moans. The inconvenience experienced by the strong sunlight through the cathedral glass during the morning service will, it is hoped, at no distant day lead to the introduction of stained glass, which is much wanted to subdue the light. And then the railways, of course, came in for criticism. The early hour at which the first train leaves Peterborough in the morning prevented many from attending the reopening of the above church. The train left Peterborough at 7:43 and arrived in Oakham at 9 o'clock, with 6 stops in between, as opposed to the one at present. And the opening of the church wasn't till 11 o'clock in the morning. So clearly 7:45 was too early in morning for the carriages of the lords and ladies to deposit them at Peterborough station. There were notices of the opening of the church, and there is a notice there as an extract from it. I blow it up, and you can see the attractions put on to pull people into the church were basically sermons. In those days, somewhat unlike the present, it seems that advertising sermons and sermon speakers was a way to induce a crowd to come and see. Not anymore, it isn't. So, Gothic restored. Now onto the last part of the talk, Gothic justified. There was a lecture by the Reverend Canon James that I've already talked about, already mentioned, in 1860. He writes, or spoke, they had now obtained a building most suitable for the proper and reverential worship of Almighty God. No square room could ever have been appropriate or of half so much utility. They had a church which they ought to be indeed proud. An apology for a beautiful structure would be very much like Bishop Watson's apology for the Bible. He contended, that is, Canon James contended, that Gothic churches had a tendency to produce devotional feelings in the heart of the worshippers. He then tried to say that Gothic architecture was essentially un-Roman in its character. And he believed there's only one church in Rome which affects that style, and that was the great papal church of St. Peter's at Rome in the classic style of architecture and not in the Gothic, to which it is totally opposed. If faith, he says, if were judged by architecture, then it would be more proper to condemn St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey, for the former was far more in the Romish style. And while on the subject, he observed that the practice of placing the altar at the east end of churches was copied from the primitive and not from the Roman church. The altar in most Romish places of worship was placed at the west end, as at St. Peter's, Rome. Well, it certainly wasn't St. Peter's, Rome, because it had to sit above the tomb of St. Peter. But nearly all other Catholic churches, the altar was at the east end. And I find it interesting that there is a perceived need here to say, although we're in essence copying the Roman style that's come out of the Oxford movement, out of Pugin's work, we're nonetheless having to distance ourselves from Catholicism quite strongly. An interesting dynamic. The triple division of nave, chancel, and altar was still preserved, but no root screen now shut out the laity. It was open to all. It was held by some that the multiplied pillars in Gothic churches were an obstruction to properly seeing what was going on. But he thought broken church induced feelings more reverential, more solemn, and more able for worship than would be produced by four square walls like a concert room. I don't really understand that. From a modern perspective, and I suspect from a Victorian perspective, the chief utility for the congregation of the pillars was not to provide a more reverential, more solemn place for worship, but rather as to give somewhere to hide behind so they can't be seen from the front. But perhaps I'm just being a cynic here. But that really brings my talk to a close. Some general thoughts on the history of All Saints, and some interesting ideas perhaps on how the restoration was viewed in the wider context. And it still leaves me with two questions. Was there indeed a possible early church group at Oakham? I don't know. Was the lowering of the chancel a communion room or just a cheap rebuild? Again, I really wouldn't know about that, but I'd be happy to discuss that with anyone who cared to get in touch with me. My email address can be found elsewhere on the website. Thank you for listening. Thank you.